The grand hall of an international summit buzzed with anticipation. Cameras flashed, translators adjusted their headsets, and leaders from across the globe leaned forward as Emmanuel Macron rose to speak. His voice carried the familiar weight of a man representing centuries of French power, and his eyes swept across the African delegates with an air of calculated dominance. France has always stood as a pillar for its colonies, Macron declared, his tone dripping with certainty. You owe us loyalty. Without France, many of your nations would not even exist in their current form. Our guidance shaped your roads, your governments, your economies. Colonies should never forget who gave them order. A ripple of unease spread through the audience. Some nodded cautiously, others frowned. It was the same colonial narrative, polished for the modern stage, an argument that Africa was indebted, eternally tied to France by invisible chains. Macron's words were meant to remind the world that the crown of France still cast a shadow across its former territories. But one man did not flinch. Ibrahim Traoré sat upright, his military jacket sharp against the backdrop of diplomats in suits. His gaze was steady, piercing through the carefully constructed facade of Macron's authority. He waited for the silence that followed Macron's statement, then leaned forward to the microphone. Mr. Macron, Traoré's voice was calm but edged with steel, we owe you nothing. Not loyalty, not gratitude, not obedience. What you call guidance, we call chains. What you call civilization, we call theft. You took our resources, you divided our people, you erased our voices, and now you stand here demanding loyalty? The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, and hurried whispers bounced between journalists and delegates. Macron's jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the podium, but Traoré wasn't finished. Africa does not bow to you, Traoré declared. Not yesterday, not today, not ever again. The words echoed, raw and unyielding. For the first time, Macron's confidence cracked, and the stage no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the soldier from Burkina Faso, the voice of defiance, the reminder that the age of submission was the air in the summit hall grew heavier after Traoré's fiery words. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the stark contrast, Macron, the polished president in his tailored suit, and Traoré, the young soldier-turned-leader, shoulders squared and voice unwavering. Reporters furiously typed headlines, sensing history was unfolding before their eyes. Macron adjusted his microphone, trying to regain composure. His lips curled into a faint smile that was meant to disarm but carried arrogance instead. I understand your passion, Captain Traoré, he said, emphasizing the rank as if to belittle him. But nations like yours still rely on France, economically, militarily, diplomatically. Without our presence, chaos will swallow you. It is not arrogance to say that Africa owes us loyalty, it is fact. Traoré leaned back, his expression calm, almost amused. He knew the tactic, intimidation wrapped in diplomacy, the same tone France had used for decades to keep African nations under its thumb. Yet he also knew something else, the tide of history had shifted. When he spoke again, his voice cut through the tension like a blade. France believes it is the guardian of Africa. But what guardian steals from the child it claims to protect? What ally drains its friend's blood for profit? You speak of chaos, Mr. Macron, but who sowed it? Who drew borders that tore tribes apart? Who installed leaders loyal to Paris rather than to their own people? That chaos was manufactured, by colonial hands. The delegates stirred. Even leaders from outside Africa straightened in their seats. Macron's composure faltered once more, he had not expected Traoré to dismantle his argument so quickly, so thoroughly. Traoré pressed forward. Burkina Faso does not stand alone. Across the continent, a generation is rising, young, unyielding, determined. We do not beg for freedom, we declare it. And no chain, no threat, no speech will bind us again. You claim we owe you loyalty. I tell you this, we owe you nothing but the truth. And the truth is that Africa is free. The hall erupted, some clapping, others whispering furiously. Macron tried to hide his clenched jaw, but the damage was done. His declaration had been met with a fire far stronger than he had anticipated. The silence that followed was deafening. Cameras panned across the faces of world leaders, some stiff with discomfort, others lit with the spark of agreement. Macron shifted in his seat, trying to compose a new response, but the weight of Traoré's words lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Leaning slightly forward, Macron tried once more, his voice quieter, more measured, as if searching for control. "You speak of history, Captain," he said, pointedly repeating the title. "But history is complex. France did not only take, it also gave. Roads, schools, systems of governance. Without France, many nations would have lacked the structures they needed to survive. You see exploitation, I see shared progress." A murmur of skepticism rippled through the audience. Traoré raised his head slowly, his gaze fixed on Macron with the unflinching steadiness of someone who had heard this narrative too many times before. His reply came like thunder. "Shared progress," he echoed, his voice ringing through the hall. "What progress is it when the wealth of Africa built the palaces of Europe while our people starved? What progress is it when we inherit borders carved to divide us, governments propped up to control us, currencies chained to Paris? That is not progress, it is plunder dressed as charity." The applause this time was louder, undeniable. Leaders from across Africa nodded in solidarity. Even representatives from Latin America and Asia exchanged glances, recognizing echoes of their own histories. Traoré leaned closer to the microphone, his tone sharpened into steel. "You call me, Captain, as if to diminish me. But let me remind you, titles do not make leaders, actions do. And the people of Africa have chosen leaders who will not bow, who will not be bought, who will not betray their soil for a seat at another man's table. You claim to have given us roads, schools, systems. But we gave you something greater, resources, labor, and dignity. And now, we are reclaiming what is ours." The hall erupted again. Macron's face flushed, his attempt to rewrite colonial history collapsing under the force of Traoré's words. For the first time in years, a French president found himself not in control of the narrative but on the defensive, before the eyes of the world. The weight of Traoré's words seemed to shift the very air in the summit hall. For the first time, the spotlight no longer framed France as the patron but as the accused. Macron leaned back, adjusting his tie, his polished mask of diplomacy cracking under the relentless force of truth. Trying to regain control, Macron's voice sharpened. "Captain Traoré," he pressed, this time with a faint trace of irritation, "you speak boldly, but boldness without pragmatism is dangerous. The modern world thrives on alliances, on order. Africa cannot isolate itself. France does not stand in your way, we extend a hand. But if you reject that hand, you risk chaos, instability, collapse." The word collapse hung in the air like a veiled threat. Some leaders stiffened, understanding the subtext: aid withheld, sanctions imposed, interference justified. It was the same language that had chained nations for decades. But Traoré did not flinch. His eyes, dark and unyielding, locked onto Macron's with the calm fire of conviction. When he spoke, his tone carried the gravity of centuries of struggle. "Collapse," he repeated, his voice rising, echoing off the marble walls. "Africa has already known collapse, collapse brought by slave ships that tore millions from their homes. Collapse carved by colonial hands that bled our soil dry. Collapse disguised as aid that came with chains tighter than iron." The audience erupted again, some clapping, some pounding the tables in support. Traoré leaned into the microphone, his voice now steady and deliberate, each word a strike. "You speak of alliances? True alliances are born of respect, not coercion. You speak of order? Whose order? The order that starved our children while feeding your empire? We do not fear your warnings of instability, Monsieur Macron. For the greatest instability Africa ever endured, was under your flag. Macron's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. The hall was alive, electric, as the world realized it was not watching a mere exchange, it was witnessing a turning tide. The silence that followed was not passive. It was the silence of reckoning. Macron adjusted his cufflinks, his movements betraying the unease he tried to mask. He had faced dissent before, but rarely in such raw, uncompromising terms. This was not a debate, it was a dismantling of narratives that had stood for centuries. He leaned forward, his tone now colder, sharper. Captain Traoré, let us not romanticize rebellion. Every nation that defies order eventually faces the consequences. Economic stagnation. Civil unrest. Isolation. Your speeches may draw applause today, but when the dust settles, your people will ask, where is the bread? Where is the stability? Words cannot build roads, nor can defiance light homes. The audience murmured. Macron's argument, though laced with veiled threats, touched on a reality many African nations struggled with: poverty, unemployment, infrastructure gaps. For a fleeting moment, some wondered how Traoré would answer. But Traoré did not falter. His reply came like thunder rolling across dry earth. You dare speak of bread? His voice rang through the chamber, deep and commanding. It was your colonial hands that stole our grain, your companies that drained our mines, your banks that shackled us with debt. The hunger in Africa is not born from our defiance, it is the child of your greed. Gasps and shouts filled the hall. Traoré raised his hand, steadying the room before continuing. You say rebellion brings consequences. I tell you this, submission brings death. For decades we submitted, our lands carved, our leaders bought, our people enslaved by loans and lies. And what did we gain? Starvation. Exploitation. Silence. He leaned closer to the microphone, his eyes never leaving Macron. So let me make it clear. Africa's bread will be baked in African ovens. Our roads will rise from African hands. Our homes will be lit by African power. And no threat, neither of sanctions nor of isolation, will turn us back into beggars at your gates. The room erupted again, this time louder, a standing ovation from some delegates. Macron's expression froze, his authority chipped away piece by piece. What had begun as a confrontation was transforming into something greater, a declaration of emancipation, broadcast for the entire world to hear. Macron's jaw tightened, his composure slipping like a mask in a storm. The chamber's air felt electric, charged by Traoré's defiance. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every twitch of expression, every bead of sweat. This was no longer just an exchange of words, it was a duel of worlds, one clinging to fading dominance, the other rising with unshakable conviction. The French president drew a slow breath and replied, his words deliberate, heavy. Captain, pride may rouse applause, but pride does not pay debts. Who finances your projects? Who maintains your armies? Without our alliances, without our technology, you risk leading your people into a wilderness of poverty. Independence is noble, but without partnership, it is a cage of isolation. The statement hung in the air, a challenge framed as reason. Some delegates nodded, acknowledging the economic weight France still carried in African markets. Others narrowed their eyes, sensing the condescension dripping beneath the rhetoric. Traoré straightened in his seat, the green of his military uniform sharp under the hall's lights. He spoke not with hesitation but with the fire of one who had carried the weight of his people's expectations. You speak of debts, Monsieur Macron. Tell me, who owes who? Did we not bleed in your wars? Did our gold not pave your streets? Did our cocoa not sweeten your tables? Yet you call us indebted, as if centuries of plunder have not already paid your dues 1,000 times over. A wave of applause surged through the African delegations. Traoré raised his hand, signaling he had more to deliver. His voice dropped lower, steadier, each word a hammer striking iron. You say we will be isolated. Perhaps. But let it be known, we would rather stand alone with dignity than kneel together in chains. Africa is not a child clinging to its parent, it is a continent reclaiming its adulthood. And no empire, no matter how dressed in diplomacy, will convince us otherwise. The audience exploded into cheers, louder than before. Macron's face stiffened, his argument unraveling against a tide of awakening. Outside the chamber, millions were watching live, tweeting, sharing, replaying. And for the first time in decades, the narrative of Africa and France was shifting, not whispered in corridors, but shouted in the open. The air in the chamber had grown thick, charged with a tension that every camera, every microphone seemed to amplify. Macron adjusted his tie, searching for a thread of authority that had not yet unraveled. His words came quieter, but laced with a sharpened edge. You speak boldly, Captain, but bold words do not feed children. Without the infrastructure France has built, without the markets we have opened, how many of your people would still walk barefoot in villages forgotten by time? Independence, you say, but what of progress? Will you risk trading stability for pride? The insinuation was clear. That Africa's rise was borrowed, dependent, incomplete without its former masters. Gasps rippled across the hall. Some nodded cautiously, others frowned, but all eyes turned again to Traoré. The young leader leaned forward, his gaze steady, unflinching. His voice resonated with the weight of memory and the fire of determination. Progress? Let us speak of progress, Monsieur Macron. Progress was when your ships chained our ancestors. Progress was when our minds were emptied, our fields stripped bare, and our youth sent to die in wars that were not theirs. If that is the progress you offer, we want no part in it. His fist struck the table softly, not in anger, but in emphasis. The hall grew so silent that even the faint whir of the cameras could be heard. Do not mistake pride for blindness. We know the path ahead will be difficult. We know sacrifice will be required. But what you call stability is nothing but dependency. And I tell you this, Africa would rather stumble walking on its own legs than march smoothly with shackles on its feet. The audience erupted again, louder than before. Delegates from Asia and Latin America rose in applause, echoing the sentiment. Social media feeds across continents lit up with hashtags, hashtag Africa rises, hashtag no chains, hashtag Traoré versus Macron. For Macron, the hall had become a battlefield, one where the weapons were not tanks or jets, but truths spoken aloud, truths no longer afraid of consequences. And in this battle, it was clear to millions watching live who was winning. Macron's lips tightened into a thin line. The applause, the cheers, the global reaction, none of it had been part of his plan. He had expected to command respect, to remind the Hall of France's supposed indispensability. Instead, the very foundation of his argument had been shaken, and it was Traoré who stood firmly in control. You mistake anger for strength, Macron said, his tone clipped, his words deliberate. The world is not moved by emotion. It is moved by power, by economics, by alliances. You may speak passionately, Captain, but passion does not build skyscrapers, does not manufacture medicine, does not secure your borders. Without Europe, without France, Africa will find itself alone. The hall bristled with unease. Macron had drawn a sharp line, France as protector, Africa as dependent. It was the oldest narrative in the colonial playbook, and now it had been spoken plainly. Traoré leaned back, his eyes narrowing, his silence cutting deeper than any immediate reply. When he finally spoke, it was with a calm, steady voice that seemed to echo through the walls. Alone? He repeated the word, letting it linger. Do you not see? Africa has never been alone. We have each other. We have the youth, the soil, the sun, the rivers, the gold, the oil, the minds of millions ready to work. What we lacked was freedom. And freedom, once taken back, cannot be traded away. He rose slightly, his voice gaining strength. You speak of skyscrapers, but what use are tall buildings if the foundations are rotten? You speak of borders, but it was Europe that drew those borders with no thought to the people who lived within them. You speak of medicine, yet it was your corporations that charged us more for vaccines than you paid yourselves. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by murmurs of approval and the hum of cameras capturing every second. Then Traoré's voice cut through again. If you believe alliances come only through submission, then you misunderstand the future. The world is changing, Monsieur Macron. Nations rise not through chains, but through solidarity. And Africa will rise, not as your shadow, but as your equal. The hall thundered with applause once more, and Macron, for the first time in his career, looked not like a leader asserting power, but a man cornered by truths too heavy to dismiss. Macron adjusted his posture, trying to recover ground. His voice, sharper now, rang out. Captain, you speak of solidarity, but history proves otherwise. Africa has been divided, plagued by conflict, corruption, and mismanagement. When Europe left, chaos filled the vacuum. Do not pretend independence alone will heal centuries of wounds. His words struck the air like cold steel, an attempt to reassert dominance, to frame France as the reluctant caretaker. Some in the hall shifted uneasily, sensing the edge of insult in his tone. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the tension etched across both men's faces. Traoré did not flinch. He allowed Macron's words to hang, then lifted his head and fixed the French president with an unyielding stare. Chaos? He asked softly, almost in disbelief. You call it chaos when a people struggles to reclaim their identity. But what do you call centuries of theft? What do you call carving borders with rulers across maps while bleeding nations dry? What do you call replacing kings with puppets and stripping wealth while leaving hunger? Was that order, Monsieur Macron? The audience erupted into a storm of applause, the words slicing deeper than any accusation. Traoré raised his hand for silence, his tone rising, controlled yet commanding. You speak of corruption. But who taught African leaders the art of offshore accounts? Who sold weapons into our wars while preaching peace in your parliaments? Who built corporations on our minds while leaving villages in the dark? You do not get to point fingers at wounds your hands carved. Gasps and nods filled the chamber. Macron's face reddened, caught between indignation and the weight of truth. He opened his mouth to respond but faltered, the momentum shifting entirely. Then Traoré leaned forward, his voice steady, every syllable deliberate. Do not confuse dependency with destiny. Africa's destiny is not written in Paris. It is written in Ouagadougou, in Bamako, in Kinshasa, in the hearts of our people. And if you cannot accept that, then you have no place lecturing us on chaos. The roar of the room was deafening now, applause, chants, voices echoing solidarity. Macron's shoulders slumped slightly, his authority unraveling with every clap. The confrontation had become more than an exchange, it was a reckoning. The hall was alive with thunderous applause, but within that noise was something deeper, a shift, almost tangible. Journalists scribbled furiously, cameras flashed like lightning, and social media feeds across the globe lit up with Traoré's words. What had begun as a tense diplomatic exchange had now crystallized into a symbolic moment, one destined to echo far beyond the walls of the conference. Macron, visibly cornered, forced a tight smile. He raised his hand, attempting to salvage the conversation. Captain Traoré, he said, with a strained calmness, you speak with passion, but passion cannot run economies. It cannot secure borders. France has offered structure, aid, and partnership. Without us, many African nations risk collapse. The words, though spoken with confidence, fell flat in the charged air. It was the language of a past era, one where such statements went unchallenged. But today was different. Traoré stepped forward, his voice carrying above the din, clear and unwavering. You mistake control for partnership. You mistake dependence for survival. And you mistake your past dominance for our future path. Africa will not collapse without you. In fact, it will only stand taller, freer, stronger. The audience erupted again, this time louder, longer, as if the walls themselves vibrated with the sound. Delegates from African nations rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some with tears in their eyes. Even leaders from outside Africa exchanged glances, realizing they were witnessing a turning point in history. Traoré lifted his hand once more, commanding silence. His final words echoed like a declaration. The days of masters and subjects are over. We will not ask for permission to breathe, to build, or to dream. Africa is not waiting for approval, it is already walking its own path. As he stepped back, the hall stood in ovation. Macron remained seated, his face pale, his grip tightening on the podium. The contrast between the two leaders was undeniable, one clinging to a crumbling narrative, the other embodying a rising force. History had recorded the moment. And Africa, through Traoré's voice, had declared it was no longer in anyone's shadow.